Chapter 61. Escape. 4. You're weak. You don't stand a chance against me. I grabbed my blade. I could feel the estoc as an extension of my own body. The weight, the balance, the way it moved with me. All of it felt natural and right. The thrill of the fight, the dance of blades was intoxicating. This was where I belonged. With renewed vigor, I parried his next strike, the estoc moving with precision and grace. I countered with a quick thrust, aiming for his heart. He deflected it, but I was already moving, my blade slicing through the air in a series of swift strikes. Clang, clank. Our weapons clashed again and again, the forest echoing with the sound of our duel. I focused on the other party's blade, noticing the brown energy coating it as he attacked. The mana sent ripples through the air, creating a tangible aura of power. But something else was happening, too. I could see his strikes as if I knew how he was going to move before he even did. In the face of the battlefield, this was my place. My mind raced, analyzing his movements and predicting his attacks. It felt like a sixth sense, an instinct honed from years of fencing and combat training. Swoosh! His blade came at me with incredible speed and strength, but I was ready. I sidestepped, deflecting his attack with a fluid motion of my estoc. The enemy's eyes narrowed in frustration, but I could see his next move forming in his mind. He's gonna feint left and strike from the right, I thought, and sure enough, his blade shifted to the left before coming at me from the right. Clank! I parried it perfectly, my estoc meeting his sword with a forceful clash. The enemy's strength was overwhelming, but I could see the path his sword would take, guided by some unseen force. His strikes were relentless, each one faster and more powerful than the last. The brown energy around his blade pulsed with every swing, sending shockwaves through my arms. But I held my ground, using my newfound ability to anticipate his attacks. He's going to thrust straight at my chest, I realized, and as his blade came forward, I twisted my body, letting his sword slide past me harmlessly. My estoc shot out in a counterattack, aiming for his side. Slash! The blade cut through his robe, drawing blood. He hissed in pain, but his eyes burned with fury. His next attack was even more ferocious, his sword moving with blinding speed. But I could see it. I could see the path his sword would take, like a premonition guiding my movements. I parried, deflected, and countered with a series of precise strikes, each one pushing him back. The enemy was faster and stronger than me, but I had the advantage in the fight. Why was that the case? It was because I had already gotten used to it. When I picked up the estoc for the first time, I was still younger than many people on the battlefield. Each time I faced an opponent stronger than myself. Never once had I encountered someone weaker than me. That was also the case when I was Bruce. Even at that time, when I was fighting with estoc, my physical abilities were not where I excelled. It was the sword. That was why I honed something else on the battlefield. I honed my skills. His movements became predictable, each strike following the path I saw in my mind. It was as if I was reading his every thought and every intention and reacting accordingly. Our blades clashed, sending sparks flying. The forest echoed with the sound of our duel, the intensity of the battle reaching its peak. The enemy's frustration grew with every failed attack, his eyes widening in disbelief as I matched him blow for blow. Clank! But just as our blades clashed for one last time, my eyes perked up. I sensed a bunch of other presences around, and that was the same for him. The other patrols are here as well. It was evident who was here and who they were. Most likely they had sensed the energy of the fight. It was even possible that they had brought another expert with them. "You're not as weak as I thought," the guy before me snarled, his voice filled with rage. His eyes glinted with fury, likely angry at the fact that he had not been able to beat me, even while I looked like a first stage awakened, and there was a 2-rank difference between us. Perhaps he was also angry at the fact that he could be discovered while trying to take my supposed artifact. "I will end this," he growled, his eyes shining brown. The earth beneath my feet suddenly cramped, trying to trap me. His power over the earth was evident, and he was using it to his full advantage. I felt the ground tighten around my legs, restricting my movement. The guy's mana surged, manifesting the full power of a third-stage warrior. He rushed at me with incredible speed, his blade gleaming with deadly intent. It was a fun fight, sad that it is going to end now. Black blade of ironclad. Iron coating. I used the energy of my second core, coating my body with a protective layer to make it seem like I was purely defending myself to my utmost strength. Heh, your measly pathetic energy will not be able to defend this. The enemy's blade connected, and I felt the impact reverberate through my body. But I held firm, enduring the blow with the reinforced coating. Of course, that was not enough as the blade was pushing through my defense and almost about to reach my shoulder. Just at that moment, I drew mana from my first and main core. The energy flowed through me, powerful and unyielding. I focused it into my estoc, the blade glowing with a fierce light. The enemy's eyes widened in surprise as he sensed the sudden surge of energy. He had not expected me to have this much power. His confidence wavered, and that was all I needed. Crack! With a swift, decisive motion, I broke free from the earth's grip, using my enhanced strength to shatter the ground around me. The enemy staggered back, his balance disrupted. Void Starfall Blade. Eclipse Star Trail. The estoc moved with incredible speed and precision, cutting through the air with a blinding light. Ha! The enemy tried to parry, but my attack was too fast, too strong. The blade pierced through his defenses, cutting deep into his chest. As the estoc drove into him, trails of stars began to emanate from the blade, wrapping around the enemy and filling the air with a mesmerizing glow. The light from the stars intensified, creating an ethereal pattern that seemed to weave through his very being. What is this? The enemy gasped, his eyes widening in terror as the trails of stars coiled tighter, their light growing ever more brilliant. The energy built up around the tip of the estoc, a focal point of destructive power. Blast! The trails of stars converged, and with a final, explosive surge, they blasted through the tip of the blade. Crunch! The force of the explosion was both silent and devastating, an implosion of energy that tore through the enemy's body from within. His scream was cut short, his form crumpling as the power of the stars consumed him. The light of the stars flared brightly for a moment, then faded, leaving nothing but a lifeless husk. It was a good fight, soldier, but your greed blinded you. I shook my head as I channeled my mana into my body. They are here. The sounds came from here. The shouts of other soldiers grew louder, their footsteps pounding through the forest. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. My time was running out. But before I could leave, something caught my attention. A faint glimmer in the moonlight, barely visible against the forest floor. I crouched down, brushing aside the leaves and dirt to reveal a ring. It was a simple band, but as I picked it up, I felt a surge of energy. The ring was embedded with a small, intricate gemstone that pulsed with mana. There was something familiar about the energy it emanated, a sense of power and mystery. An artifact, I realized. But what does it do? I had no time to ponder its purpose. The soldiers were closing in, their shouts growing more urgent. I slipped the ring into my pouch. Whatever it is, it might come in handy, I thought, rising to my feet. I glanced at the fallen-robed figure one last time, then turned and sprinted deeper into the forest. My movements were swift and fluid, my enhanced strength and agility propelling me forward. The ring's mana seemed to resonate with my own, amplifying my abilities. The shouts of the soldiers faded into the background as I put more distance between us. I moved with purpose, navigating the dense forest with ease. Each step took me further from the camp, closer to freedom. Don't think this is over yet, Lucavion. You still need to pass the forest. That was just the beginning. Chapter 62. Facing a monster. The reason why this part of the border was guarded less compared to other places was because this forest bordered the Arcanes Empire and the Lorien Empire. This forest was notorious, not for its beauty, but for the dangerous creatures that called it home. It was a place few dared to venture into, and even fewer dared to cross. The forest, known as the Shadowed Thicket, was infested with a variety of deadly monsters. These creatures, ranging from the venomous thorn vipers to the elusive shadow stalkers, made traversing the forest a perilous endeavor. The army relied on the natural dangers of the forest to act as a deterrent against most escapees and infiltrators. That's why they're confident in their lax security here, I thought as I moved through the dense underbrush. Most people wouldn't dare try to cross this forest, but they're underestimating me. The shouts of the soldiers were now a distant echo, the forest swallowing their voices as I delved deeper. The trees here grew thick and tall, their branches intertwining to form a near-impenetrable canopy. The ground was covered in a layer of fallen leaves, their dampness muffling my footsteps. At this point, I should be fully away from the camp. I had been running away from there for a while now. I also erased my smell. While I had taken measures to mask my scent, I couldn't shake the thought that they might send hounds after me. There were many special hounds in the army that specialized in tracking, their keen senses able to pick up even the faintest trail. If they send tracking hounds, especially the ones that can track mana, it'll complicate things. I can't lower my guard now, but at the same time, after the fight I just did against that third-stage soldier, I could feel fatigue creeping in. The adrenaline rush was wearing off, and my muscles ached from the exertion. No time to rest, though, I reminded myself, pushing through the tiredness. I need to keep moving. I pressed on, navigating through the dense forest with as much speed as I could muster. The shadows seemed to move with me, the darkness both a friend and a potential foe. My heightened senses kept me alert, every rustle and crackle drawing my attention. I paused for a moment, catching my breath and listening intently. The forest was eerily silent, but I could feel the presence of life all around me. Stay focused, I told myself. You've come this far. Don't let your guard down. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't ignore the growing weariness in my body. The fight with the third-stage soldier had taken a toll, and I had been running away while ignoring that for a while already. And considering that it is night, there is a high chance that I can miss some territory marks. I had been feeling a little tense for a while now, and there was a reason for that already. Something is nearby. It was different. Compared to the battlefield, this feeling was a lot more different. So, this is the feeling of being targeted by a predator, being in front of a monster. It was something I was feeling for the first time. I looked around, my eyes scanning the dense forest for any signs of movement. The shadows seemed to shift and dance, but I couldn't identify anything specific. My eyes failed me, unable to pierce through the darkness and foliage. There's nothing, I thought, frustration creeping in. But I can feel it. It's close. Realizing that my eyes were useless in this situation, I knew I had to rely on something else. I took a deep breath, calming my mind and centering my thoughts. Slowly, I closed my eyes and began to spread my senses, reaching out with my mana to form a circle around me. The world around me came alive in a different way. I could sense the subtle vibrations of the forest, the flow of mana through the trees and ground. It was as if I had become a part of the forest itself, my senses expanding and merging with the environment. Well, that was not that dramatic, but the basic idea of spreading senses was similar to this. I focused, pushing my awareness further out, feeling for any disturbances in the natural order. I created a circle around myself. The reason for this is clear. While spreading one's senses is important and a basic ability for a third-star warrior, it also uses quite a bit of mana. And since I had just recently broken through and had been running for a while, I had yet to recover the mana that I had spent. That is the reason I created a small circle with a 5-meter radius. From the moment someone or something enters there, I can strike. My blade's reach is around 3 meters if we add my arms and my mana coating's length. And the 2 meters is for my reaction time. I placed my hand on my estoc, ready to draw it at the right moment. The tension in the air was palpable, the sense of danger pressing in on me from all sides. Swoosh! Suddenly, something entered my circle at a rapid speed. My senses flared, the disturbance clear and immediate. I reacted instantly, my body moving on instinct. My eyes snapped open as I drew my sword, the blade coated with a dark starlight. Swoosh! My estoc cut through the air, meeting the incoming threat head-on. Keek! The creature, a shadow stalker, lunged at me, its eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. My blade struck true, the dark starlight slicing through its hide and eliciting a chilling scream. Screech! The shadow stalker recoiled, its attack thwarted. Series. It cried, its eyes burning with fury. I knew I couldn't let my guard down. Shadow stalkers had a unique ability to disappear from sight, blending seamlessly into the shadows around them. This creature would likely use that to its advantage now that its initial assault had failed. Stay focused, I reminded myself. This isn't over yet. Drawing on my knowledge, I recalled the records Elias had left behind. He had documented many of the creatures in the shadowed thicket, providing invaluable information for anyone brave or foolish enough to traverse it. As for why he did that, before being sent here, he was actually preparing for a debate between scholars. Thanks to him, I knew the shadow stalker's tricks. The creature vanished, its form melting into the darkness. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. There was a reason why this forest was feared this much. A shadow stalker's physical strength is estimated to be similar to that of a stage 2 warrior, but their danger level is higher, and so are their stealth abilities. That is why this forest is too dangerous for those below stage 3, as it is nearly impossible to pass without having the ability to spread one's mana senses across the place. As the monster vanished, I was prepared. I closed my eyes once more, spreading my senses, feeling for any disturbance in the natural order. The circle of awareness around me pulsed with energy, the mana flowing through me and into the surrounding area. The shadow stalker couldn't hide from my senses. Not entirely. I could feel its presence, a faint but unmistakable ripple in the mana around me. There, I thought, pinpointing its location. The shadow stalker dashed forward once more, attacking me head-on. This time I was ready. I opened my eyes, my estoc already moving in anticipation of the creature's charge. The dark starlight coating the blade flared brilliantly as I swung it in a precise arc. Clang! The creature's claws met my estoc, but the force of my strike pushed it back. The shadow stalker hissed, its eyes gleaming with anger and frustration. It lunged at me again, faster and more aggressive, aiming for my face. Swoosh! I sidestepped, the estoc moving in a fluid motion. The blade extended, catching the creature mid-leap. The estoc pierced through its chest, dark starlight searing its flesh. Screech! The shadow stalker let out a final, chilling cry as it collapsed to the ground, its body twitching in its death throes. I stood over it, breathing heavily, the estoc still glowing with the residual energy of the strike. The forest fell silent once more, the oppressive shadows receding slightly. I had defeated the shadow stalker, but I knew there could be more lurking in the darkness. I had to stay vigilant. I knelt beside the creature, examining it briefly. Elias's records had been accurate, and my training had paid off. But this was just one of many dangers in the shadowed thicket. That is right. If the shadow stalker is appearing, that means I am now in their territory. I looked closely at the shadow stalker's eyes. As I had expected, the monster's eyes were closed and not clearly open. Their eyes were not their primary means of sensing the world. Instead, they relied on something else, an innate sense, a combination of hearing, smell, and possibly a form of mana detection. Elias's book had mentioned this peculiarity. He had stated that while shadow stalkers lived close to each other, they were not gregarious. They were solitary hunters, territorial, and fiercely independent. This meant that while I might encounter more shadow stalkers, they would likely be spread out rather than grouped together. Good. At least I won't be facing a pack of them. Most importantly, their blood acted as a monster repellent during this stage of the forest. Chapter 63. Facing a Monster. 2. Elias speculated that the reason why shadow stalkers were not gregarious was because they tended to use others as bait. In a way, they did not trust their kin. They also tended to use their kin's blood as a measurement of danger. If they sensed that their kin was injured, it would imply that the enemy was dangerous. In that way, they were good at surviving. I knelt beside the fallen shadow stalker and retrieved a small vial from my pouch. Carefully, I collected some of its blood, the dark liquid shimmering faintly in the moonlight. This would be my safeguard, a way to create a space where I could rest without being disturbed by other creatures. I moved to the edge of the clearing and poured the blood into a small circle around me. The pungent scent would keep other monsters at bay, giving me a much-needed reprieve. The effects were immediate. The forest around me seemed to quiet, the subtle sounds of creatures shifting away, sensing the danger implied by the shadow stalker's blood. That should give me enough time for today. I sat down, leaning against a large tree, and closed my eyes for a moment. The weariness hit me harder than I expected. I had been coating my body with mana for so long, and the fight had drained my reserves even further. My mana core was nearly depleted, and I needed to recover. Just a short rest, I thought, my body relaxing slightly. As I rested, I thought back to Elias's notes. He had always emphasized the importance of understanding one's environment and the creatures within it. Knowledge was as much a weapon as any blade. Using their own instincts against them, I mused. Shadow stalkers don't trust each other. They're solitary because they know their kin will abandon or betray them to survive. This understanding gave me an edge. It was one of the many lessons Elias had taught me, lessons that now kept me alive in the shadowed thicket. I focused on my breathing, allowing myself to enter a meditative state. Slowly, I drew in the ambient mana from the forest, careful not to disturb the delicate balance around me. It was a slow process, but I could feel my core beginning to replenish. Just at that moment, I sensed something that was odd. For an awakened, they needed to mediate to recover the mana they had spent. And because Lucavion had been running around for a while, his mana reserves were almost depleted. Thus, he closed his eyes and imagined drawing mana from the atmosphere. Just like as usual, he was using the technique that he had learned from his master, Devourer of Stars. But at that moment, his eyebrows twitched as if something was different. Being a third stage awakened, he did this process countless different times, and he had never felt something like this before. Lucavion took a deep breath, trying to focus his mind. The place around him was littered with the remnants of his recent struggle, but his attention was drawn to the massive carcass of the shadow stalker lying nearby. As he continued his meditation, Lucavion began to sense an unusual energy. It was faint at first, like a whisper in the wind, but it gradually grew more distinct. This energy was not the usual mana he drew from the atmosphere. It felt different, darker, more ominous. He opened his eyes and looked at the shadow stalker's corpse, a sense of unease settling over him. "What's this?" he muttered to himself, curiosity and caution intertwining in his mind. Closing his eyes once more, Lucavion focused on the eerie energy emanating from the dead creature. As he concentrated, he realized that this energy was being drawn to him, almost as if it were alive. It was a cold, unsettling sensation, unlike the warm and vibrant flow of normal mana. Despite his apprehension, Lucavion allowed the energy to approach, letting it merge with his own depleted reserves. The moment the eerie energy touched him, he felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if the essence of the shadow stalker had intertwined with his own mana, bringing with it a sense of death and darkness. "What is this?" For a moment he panicked, fearing that this foreign energy might corrupt him. But then he remembered his training and the teachings of his master. No matter what, keep your calm. He steadied his breathing and focused on harmonizing the strange energy with his own. The Devourer of Stars technique and the cold energy clashed, and his body hurt. Dash! A pained groan left his body. This was the second time his master's technique was reacting to energy. It did not do it when he was accumulating the mana from Black Blade of Iron art. It is similar to Serpent Flame art, he thought. At that time, the fire energy of Serpent Flame art had also clashed with Devourer of Stars. Lucavion's eyes widened as he understood. The energy he was absorbing was also an attributed one. That was why Devourer of Stars was reacting, as it reacted against attributed arts. But then he sensed that the energy was cold and chilly. He closed his eyes, thinking about the nature of the energy. The Serpent Flame art had reacted to my core as the fire inside it was destructive. But at the same time, this one is cold. An idea sparked in his mind, one that could be dangerous. He would attempt to combine the energies. He closed his eyes once again and began absorbing the energy from the atmosphere. He drew in just enough to feel the flow without overwhelming himself. Then, he accumulated the mana using the serpent flame art. The fire mana and the eerie cold mana began to mix within him. For a moment, his body did not react negatively. A small smile formed on Lucavion's lips, thinking he had succeeded in harmonizing the two energies. But then, without warning, the mana scattered, leaving his body. The cold energy dissipated into the air, and the fire attribute mana extinguished itself. "What the?" Lucavion muttered, confusion and frustration seeping into his voice. He had felt so close to achieving something unprecedented, yet it had slipped away. He closed his eyes again, determined to understand what had happened. This time, he focused on the interaction between the two types of mana. The cold, eerie energy of the Shadow Stalker was not just any energy. It was infused with death and darkness. The fire mana of the serpent flame art was destructive and pure, but it also had a life-affirming warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold death mana. They can coexist, but they need a mediator, he thought. Something to balance the opposing natures. Lucavion drew in a deep breath and began the process again, this time more cautiously. If that is the case, what if I use the core of Black Blade of Iron? That one only harnesses raw mana and does not have any attributes. That could be possible. He absorbed a small amount of the fire energy around him. At the same time, he was also not that experienced at serpent flame art, as while he had converted the art to suit his own condition, he could not constantly practice it as his body was rejecting it. That was why he was now in pain. It hurts. It is burning once again, he thought as he felt the feeling of getting burned all across his body. But at the same time, he gritted his teeth, enduring the pain. But then he had drawn a bit of the cold energy and mixed it with a minuscule amount of fire mana. The burning sensation had disappeared as the cold mixed with fire. As the energies clashed, he inserted a tiny bit of his own neutral mana to act as a stabilizer. Slowly, he felt the energies beginning to harmonize. The process was painstakingly slow, but Lucavion persisted. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he concentrated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he felt the energies stabilize within him. They were not perfectly balanced, but they no longer rejected each other outright. "I see," he thought, gazing at his core. There were now two distinct energies residing within it, one that had been nurtured by his old family's teachings and one that had been drawn from the death of the Shadow Stalker. The two energies swirled together in a delicate dance, neither overpowering the other, but existing in a tenuous balance. Lucavion decided to test the power of this new energy. He focused on his core, attempting to draw the mana into his body. At first, he met with resistance, as if the energies were reluctant to be disturbed. The dark, eerie energy, in particular, seemed to cling stubbornly to the core, refusing to be summoned. But Lucavion was persistent. He coaxed the mana gently, inserting a trickle of his own neutral energy to persuade it to move. Slowly, the dark mana began to respond. It crawled out from his core, seeping into his body like tendrils of shadow. The sensation was strange, cold, yet not unpleasant. It was like a wave of darkness wrapping around him, spreading through his veins and bones. The amount of mana he managed to draw was minimal, just a tiny fraction of what he was used to wielding. Yet, as the mana reached his skin, it caused his entire body to glow with a faint, ominous light. His skin tingled with the sensation of power surging through him, an intensity he hadn't expected. Even this small amount of dark energy felt overwhelming, almost too powerful to contain. This is Chapter 64, Weird Energy. Lucavion's eyes widened in shock as the energy continued to flow. He had never felt anything like this before. It was as if his entire being was charged with raw, untamed power, one that could easily slip beyond his control if he wasn't careful. "What is this?" he whispered, marveling at the transformation. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as he looked back at his core. The eerie, black mana had now settled within, its presence dominating the once familiar space. The more he studied it, the more he realized how profoundly it had altered him. Curious, Lucavion attempted to channel this energy into a technique he was familiar with, the Black Blade of Iron. It was a fundamental skill he had practiced for a year. But as he focused on summoning the familiar raw mana, he felt something strange. Nothing happened. The black mana inside his core refused to cooperate. Instead of forming the solid, sharp blade he had mastered, the energy merely swirled chaotically, resisting his attempts to shape it. It was as if the man had a will of his own, rejecting his efforts to control it in the usual way. No, it is not rejecting me. It is just the mana accumulation art of Black Blade of Iron can no longer be used. It was something that he could understand. After all, the Black Blade of Iron was an art that would utilize the raw mana that he stuffed into his core. The mana that is formed in his core was no longer the same raw, attributeless mana that he would be using. It was rather different. The energy from the Shadow Stalker as well as the energy from the Serpent Flame Spear were both attributed mana, and they were somehow mixed. It makes sense that I am unable to utilize it. In an easy way, the core that was formed by the Black Blade of Iron was now serving as a sanctuary for these two mana types to coexist together. Aside from that, there is nothing else that can be considered as the remnants of Black Blade of Iron, as all of them were now overwritten. That brings us to the main problem. How am I going to draw this mana to effectively utilize it? Lucavion pondered, searching for an answer in the depths of his mind. And then, something came to him. The Serpent Flame Spear, his family's technique. He had tried to adapt it to his unique condition of reversed meridians, but he had not been able to practice it extensively. The technique was designed to harness the fierce, destructive power of fire mana, channeling it into a deadly spear of flame. But perhaps it could be the key to controlling this new, volatile mix of energies within his core. Lucavion took a deep breath, and his decision was made. He would try to circulate the mana inside his meridians using the Serpent Flame Spear technique. It was a risky move, but it was the only idea that made sense in this situation. He began by focusing on the mana in his core, willing it to move through his body in the pattern of the Serpent Flame Spear. The moment he attempted it, he felt the energies react. The cold, dark mana resisted while the fiery energy surged forward, eager to follow the familiar path. The clash between the two was immediate and intense. Arg! Lucavion gasped as pain shot through his body. His veins felt like they were on fire, the conflicting energies burning him from the inside out. He gritted his teeth, trying to force the mana to obey, but it was like trying to mix oil and water. They simply wouldn't blend, and his body paid the price for it. His vision blurred, and his limbs trembled under the strain. The pain was almost unbearable, and he could feel his control slipping. Howl! He was on the verge of collapse when suddenly, a loud howl pierced the air, snapping him out of his trance. Lucavion's eyes shot open, his senses immediately on high alert. The howl was close, too close, and it reminded him of the dire situation he was in. He was in the middle of hostile territory, wounded and vulnerable. This was not the time to be experimenting with dangerous techniques. I need to stop, he realized, forcing himself to halt the circulation of the mana. The moment he did, the searing pain began to fade, leaving him gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. Don't get excited, Lucavion. They can still pursue you, he thought, looking at his own body. Thanks to his strength as a 3-star, his body was already recovering. Recover your mana and leave this place as soon as possible. And then he focused on recovering his strength. The air was thick with tension as a group of men, their uniforms adorned with various insignias and medals, gathered around the lifeless body sprawled on the cold, cobblestone ground. The night was silent, save for the distant murmurs of soldiers and the occasional crackle of a torch. One of the officers, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, knelt down, examining the fatal wound that had ended the man's life. His gloved hand brushed against the blood-soaked fabric, and he frowned deeply. He is dead, the officer muttered, his voice low and filled with a mix of frustration and disbelief. Yeah, he is, replied another officer, a younger man with sharp features, his eyes fixed on the body. Rykard didn't stand a chance. Whoever did this, they're not just some common soldier. The older officer stood up, his gaze hardening as he turned to the guards standing a few paces away, their faces pale in the torchlight. You there, he barked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Did you see his face? The guards, two young men barely out of their teens, stiffened at the question. One of them swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously between the officers. He was too fast, sir, the guard stammered, his voice trembling slightly. It all happened so quickly, we could barely see him. Just a blur, and then he was gone. Too fast, the older officer repeated, his tone sharp with incredulity. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he stared down the young guard. You're telling me you didn't get even a glimpse of him? Not a single detail. The guard hesitated, glancing at his companion for support. The other guard nodded, equally nervous. We're sorry, sir. We tried to keep up, but it was like he vanished into thin air. One moment he was there, and the next he wasn't. The younger officer cursed under his breath, kicking at a loose stone in frustration. Damn it! A 3-star warrior, maybe more, and we have nothing to go on? We're blind here. The older officer remained silent for a moment, his mind working furiously. He looked down at the body once more, a cold determination settling in his eyes. This wasn't a random attack. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. He muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. That stab and how he was blasted from inside. That technique was powerful. Too powerful. The younger officer nodded, his expression troubled. I wonder how we had a soldier like this in our camp. And how come such a strong soldier wasn't registered under a seal? He's a 3-star awakened, that's certain. He must be hiding his strength, the older officer replied, though his tone was laced with uncertainty. Hiding his strength. The younger officer trailed off, his gaze drifting back to the body on the ground. That can indeed happen. But why? Being a 3-star, he would have gotten a good position inside the military. Why would he try to escape? That's what I don't understand either, the older officer said, his voice edged with frustration. And on top of that, he killed that bastard Rykard out of all the guards. The Count will be furious. Suddenly, one of the soldiers standing at attention behind them stepped forward. His movements were hesitant, as if he was unsure whether to speak or not. The officers noticed him, and the older one gestured for him to come closer. Speak up, soldier, the older officer commanded. What is it? The soldier cleared his throat, his voice wavering slightly. Sir, I saw something on his face. The officers exchanged a quick glance before the younger one stepped closer. His curiosity piqued. Something on his face? He asked, leaning in with a frown. The soldier nodded, his eyes darting nervously between the officers. Yes, sir. There was a long vertical scar over his right eye. At those words, the older officer's eyes widened slightly. He stiffened, his gaze snapping back to the corpse on the ground. Kneeling once more, he carefully examined the wound. A precise and thin stab, not from a normal sword. His mind raced, connecting the dots, and as he looked back up at the soldier, his expression grew more severe. A long vertical scar over the right eye, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The younger officer, sensing the shift in the older man's demeanor, asked, Do you know who it might be, sir? The older officer slowly stood up, his face a mask of grim realization. I have an idea, he said, his tone now carrying a heavy weight. There's only one man I know who fits that description. A 1-star awakened who uses an S-stock of all weapons. He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in before he uttered the name that had come to mind. Lucavion, Chapter 65. Not letting go. Life was recently getting better for Jessie. She had finally found a place where she could be with herself after being in that damned household for a long time. Though the process of reaching this place was not all that easy, she was somehow able to do it in the end. And it is all thanks to Lucavion. Jessie moved slowly around the tent, her fingers lightly brushing against the objects that bore traces of Lucavion. His belongings were simple, but they held a warmth that made her feel safe, a stark contrast to the cold and unfeeling atmosphere of her family's estate. The tent wasn't just a temporary shelter. It had become a sanctuary, a place where she could let down her guard and simply exist. As she touched the edge of his bedroll, she smiled softly. Lucavion's scent lingered, a mix of earth and faint traces of metal from his weaponry. It was a scent that had come to represent stability and protection in her life, something she had craved for so long. Jessie could still remember the moment she had first stepped into this tent, exhausted and on the brink of giving up. Felt like a lifetime ago. She knelt beside the small chest where he kept his personal effects, running her hand over its rough surface. Everything here was a reminder of him, his strength, his resilience, and the kindness he had shown her when she needed it the most. A kindness she had never known before. Her thoughts drifted back to that first day on the battlefield, when she had arrived broken and hopeless, ready to welcome death as a release from the pain that had consumed her life. That day, she had been nothing more than a shell of a person, barely able to stand under the weight of her despair. She had been sent to the front lines by her own family, cast aside like trash, and she had believed with every fiber of her being that she was worthless. Her self-esteem had been shattered, ground to dust by years of neglect and scorn. The hatred she felt for the world, and for herself, was all-consuming. But then she met Lucavion. She closed her eyes and let the memories flow, recalling the words he had spoken to her when she had been at her lowest. His voice had been calm, steady, and firm, cutting through the haze of her despair with an almost painful clarity. You are not defined by what others think of you, Jessie. You are not weak just because they say you are. Strength is something you build, not something you're born with. The battlefield doesn't care about your bloodline or your past. Out here, what matters is your will to survive and keep fighting. My master had once said something like this: the strength, it is always within you whether you believe it or not. In the end, it always ends like this. Either you get your life together, or you end up disappearing like dust in the pages of history. So I am going to say it once. Either you use your own strength to take your fate onto your own hands, or you will be forgotten until you die. Those words had struck something deep within her, something she hadn't even realized was still alive. A spark of hope buried under layers of fear and self-loathing. Lucavion had seen in her what she could not see in herself, a potential for strength, for survival. He had given her something to hold onto when she had nothing left. That was why she felt this calm. And was it why, whenever she was close to him, she would want to feel his warmth? It was not too much to ask, was it? Jessie hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered herself onto Lucavion's bed. The rough fabric was cool against her skin, and she could feel the lingering warmth of where he had been earlier. Closing her eyes, she buried her face into the bedroll, inhaling deeply. His scent was there, faint but unmistakable. A mix of the earth, the faint tang of metal, and something uniquely him. It was comforting, grounding her in a way that nothing else could. She knew it was kind of creepy, this strange attachment she had developed, but it wasn't like there weren't other creeps out there doing far worse. Besides, Lucavion's scent was a lot better than the stench of the other soldiers, most of whom didn't bother with cleanliness after long days of fighting. At least Lucavion always took care of himself and, by extension, made the space around him feel a little more bearable in this harsh environment. As she lay there, she felt a calm settle over her, something she only ever felt in his presence. It was a serenity she had come to crave, something that helped her hold onto the last vestiges of hope and strength she had. I can give you anything you want, for you who saved me from the depths of hell, she thought, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wasn't sure where these feelings would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She would do anything to protect what they had. But then, suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching outside. Her heart jumped, and she immediately lifted her head, her senses sharpening. The sound was unmistakable, Multiple people were heading toward the tent. Panic set in. What if they caught her like this? What would they think? She quickly scrambled off the bed, smoothing out the wrinkles she had made in the bedroll and brushing her hair back into place. Standing up straight, she tried to calm her racing heart, forcing herself to adopt a composed demeanor. Just as she finished adjusting herself, the flap of the tent was pushed aside, and several figures entered. Her breath hitched as she did not recognize any of the people there. But as she looked at the badges around their uniforms, she realized who they were. Colonels and a general. She realized that she was now in the presence of a general. The tension in the air was palpable as the colonels and the general stepped inside the tent, their eyes immediately locking onto her. She could feel their scrutiny, the weight of their authority pressing down on her as they took in the sight of her standing alone in the tent. Her breath hitched, and for a brief moment, she feared they could hear the rapid beating of her heart. One of the colonels, a stern-faced man with a chiseled jaw and piercing eyes, took a step forward. His gaze was sharp, cutting through her composure like a blade. "Where is Soldier Lucavion?" he asked, his voice commanding and laced with suspicion. "And what are you doing in his tent?" She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "Colonel, Lucavion was called by Colonel Morgan," she explained, her tone respectful but edged with the nervousness she couldn't quite suppress. "I was waiting for him to return." The colonels exchanged quick, silent glances, their expressions unreadable. The general, an imposing figure with silver hair and a grave demeanor, remained silent, his eyes fixed on her, assessing. Sensing the unease in the air, she hesitated before asking, Did something happen to Lucavion?" The stern-faced colonel's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "He is under suspicion," he began, his voice low but firm, "of committing a serious crime." Her heart dropped at the words, her mind racing to comprehend the situation. "Suspicion? What kind of crime?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, fear creeping into her tone despite her best efforts to remain calm. The colonel's gaze didn't waver as he responded, "Murder and deserting. Lucavion is suspected of killing Rykard, one of the guards stationed at the border, while escaping from the army. He is believed to be far more dangerous than we initially thought." She felt a cold wave of shock wash over her, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Lucavion? Murder? Deserter? It didn't make sense. He was a skilled soldier, yes, but a killer? And he left? Escaped from the battlefield? "Colonel," she stammered, trying to regain her composure, "there must be some mistake. Lucavion, he wouldn't—" The colonel cut her off, his tone unyielding. "The evidence points to him, and we cannot ignore that. We've been informed that he might be hiding his true strength, and given the circumstances, it's imperative we locate him immediately." Jessie stood frozen, the world around her narrowing to the words echoing in her mind. Murder, deserting, escaping from the battlefield. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the tent, leaving her in a suffocating silence, her thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion. The colonel's voice continued, asking her questions. Where Lucavion might have gone, if he had said anything unusual, if she had noticed any changes in his behavior. But the words barely registered in her mind. All she could focus on was the idea that Lucavion, the person who had saved her, who had given her a reason to keep fighting, was being accused of such heinous acts. There's no way, she thought desperately. Lucavion wouldn't do that. He wouldn't abandon me. Not after everything we've been through together. The memories of their time together flashed through her mind. His words of encouragement, his steady presence beside her on the battlefield. The way he had taught her to believe in herself when no one else did. He had always been there, a constant, unyielding force in her life. How could he just leave without a word? How could he commit such a betrayal? The colonel's voice broke through her thoughts, demanding her attention. "Jesse Burns, did he tell you anything about his plans? Did he mention anything about leaving or escaping?" She blinked, her heart pounding as she struggled to find her voice. "And no, Colonel," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "He didn't say anything. He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't leave." Not like this. But even as she said the words, doubt began to creep into her mind. It was late, far too late. Lucavion should have returned by now. Where was he? Had he really left her? The possibility twisted her stomach into knots, the realization slowly dawning on her like a cold, harsh light. What if he really did leave? The thought clawed at her, tearing through the fragile hope she had clung to. What if he abandoned me, just like everyone else? Her breath caught in her throat as she replayed their last conversation. The way he had spoken to her, almost as if he were saying goodbye without actually saying the words. The pieces began to fall into place, each one slicing through her heart with the sharpness of betrayal. He left, she thought, the words heavy and bitter. He left me, just like they all did. The pain was familiar, a deep, aching wound that had never fully healed. But this time it was different. This time, it wasn't just the pain of being abandoned. It was the pain of being betrayed by the one person she had thought she could trust. Her hands trembled, her mind spiraling as the truth settled in. Lucavion was gone. He had left her, just like everyone else, without a word, without a warning. The cold, empty feeling of abandonment washed over her. But it didn't break her this time. Instead, it ignited something dark and twisted within her. No, she thought, her grip tightening on the edge of the bedroll. I won't let him leave me. I won't be abandoned again. Not by him. Her heart hardened, her thoughts sharpening into a singular focus. Lucavion had been the one to save her, to give her life meaning when she had nothing left. She wouldn't let him disappear, wouldn't let him escape her grasp. If he thought he could leave her behind, he was wrong. I'll find you, Lucavion, she vowed silently, her eyes darkening with a fierce, obsessive determination. I'll find you and I'll make you see. You can't leave me, not after everything we've been through. You belong with me. You're mine. Chapter 66. On the camp. As she stood there, frozen in place, the colonel's sharp eyes turned to the other officers. We need to investigate this matter further. Secure the area and gather anyone who might have seen him. I want this camp searched from top to bottom. If Lucavion is still here, we'll find him. The officers nodded in unison, their expressions grim as they dispersed to carry out the orders. Jessie watched them leave, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Lucavion wouldn't just kill someone and flee, at least not the Lucavion she knew. Moments later, more soldiers entered the tent, their faces set in determined lines as they began to search through Lucavion's belongings. Jessie stood to the side, watching in silence as they rifled through his things, hoping against hope that they would find some clue that proved his innocence. But with each passing second, her hope dwindled. The soldiers found his bedroll empty, his gear missing, and the few personal items he had left behind carefully arranged as if he had planned his departure. It was becoming increasingly clear that Lucavion had indeed fled. One of the soldiers, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, looked up from his search, holding out a piece of parchment. Sir, I found this tucked under the bedroll. The colonel took the parchment, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. His frown deepened as he read, and when he finished, he looked up, his expression one of grim certainty. This is it, he said, his voice heavy. The colonel handed the parchment to one of the other officers, who quickly scanned it before nodding in agreement. It all points to him, the officer said, his tone resigned. His equipment is gone, and there are traces of him leaving in a hurry. No one has seen him since last night. The colonel's eyes darkened, and then, at that moment, someone else entered the tent. Colonel Morgan had verified that he had indeed called Lucavion Thorne to give him the reward. What was the reward? A high-rank mana essence. Colonel said that Lucavion was dismissed around 7 p.m. The colonel's grip tightened on the parchment as the new information was relayed. His mind raced, piecing together the puzzle as more and more evidence pointed to Lucavion's betrayal. The revelation of the high-rank mana essence made everything even more complicated. Lucavion had been rewarded, yet within hours, he had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving death and chaos in his wake. The colonel turned to face the newcomer, his expression stern. Dismissed at 7 p.m., you say? And after receiving a high-rank mana essence, no less. The weight of the situation bore down on the colonel, but before he could speak further, the general, who had been silent until now, finally opened his mouth. His voice was deep, measured, and carried the authority of years of command. He most likely had an artifact on him, the general said, his tone contemplative but laced with a hint of concern. Something that helped him hide his strength. It would explain how he managed to remain under our radar for so long. Or, he paused, his gaze sharpening. He had an artifact that allowed him to amplify his abilities temporarily. That could be why he was able to leave this place so swiftly after the deed was done. The general's words hung in the air, a chilling possibility that made the situation even more dire. If Lucavion had access to such an artifact, it would mean they were dealing with more than just a rogue soldier. He was now a serious threat. The general's eyes, sharp and discerning, turned to the colonel. I want a full background check on Soldier Lucavion, he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. I want to know everything about him, where he came from, who he trained under, any unusual behavior or reports. Everything. The colonel nodded swiftly, his respect for the general evident. I'll see to it immediately, sir. The general's gaze didn't waver as he continued. And I assume a pursuit team has already been dispatched? The colonel straightened, his voice steady. Yes, sir. As soon as Rykard's body was discovered, we deployed the hounds. They're tracking him as we speak. The general's eyes narrowed slightly, a calculated gleam in their depths as he spoke. Good, he repeated, his voice firm. But don't let them dive too deep into the forest. The colonel tilted his head slightly, a hint of curiosity flickering across his features. Sir, there's a reason that forest is known as the Shadowed Thicket, the general explained, his tone darkening as he continued. It's not just dense with trees and undergrowth. It's a place where the natural order doesn't apply. Many who enter that forest don't return, and those who do, they're never the same. There are things in there that we don't fully understand. It's a place of great danger, and sending men in there blindly would be a grave mistake. The colonel's expression tightened as he absorbed the general's words. The Shadowed Thicket was a place whispered about in fearful tones. Its reputation was shrouded in mystery and dread. He had heard tales, but the way the general spoke of it made the threat all the more real. The general continued, his voice steady but grave. If that bastard, Lucavion, has been hiding his strength all this time, it means he's far more capable than we initially believed. The hounds are skilled, but they're not equipped to handle someone like him. At best, they can force him to flee deeper into the forest. But if that happens, he'll be in significant danger himself. The colonel listened intently, his mind racing to keep up with the implications. The general was right. If Lucavion was driven into the heart of the Shadowed Thicket, his survival would be uncertain at best. There, he would either die or survive, the general said, his tone cold and pragmatic. If he dies, it means he's punished for what he did. Justice of a sort. But if he survives, that would mean he's already strong enough to take down the hounds. And if that's the case, it would be illogical to sacrifice more soldiers when our situation on the battlefield is already so grim. The colonel swallowed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The general's reasoning was sound. There was no point in throwing more lives into the fray if Lucavion had truly become that dangerous. The soldiers were already stretched thin, their morale fragile after weeks of relentless conflict. The general's gaze hardened as he delivered his final order. We must silence everything about this matter. The soldiers' morale is already at an all-time low, and if word of this scandal spreads, it will only make things more complex. Lucavion's actions must be kept under wraps. We can't afford to let this weaken our forces further. The colonel nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the general's directive. Understood, sir. I'll ensure that the men are discreet and that this situation remains contained. The general's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained sharp. Good. We're fighting a war on multiple fronts, Colonel. We can't afford to lose any more ground, especially to internal strife. Focus on the bigger picture. The less our soldiers know about this, the better. The colonel straightened, his resolve firming as he absorbed the general's words. I'll make sure of it, sir. The general nodded once, then turned to leave the tent, his steps purposeful and measured. The colonel watched him go, the weight of his orders settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew what had to be done, but that didn't make it any easier. As the general's figure disappeared into the darkness outside, the colonel took a deep breath, steeling himself for the tasks ahead. Lucavion was now an enemy. Whether he survived the shadowed thicket or not, he was a threat that had to be dealt with swiftly and silently. The battlefield was unforgiving, and in times like these, tough decisions had to be made. The colonel would ensure that those decisions were carried out with the precision and discretion demanded by the situation. Without another word, he exited the tent, his mind already calculating the next steps to secure both the camp and the fragile morale of the soldiers under his command. 30 minutes passed, the silence of the forest only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant howl of a creature. My breathing had steadied, and I could feel the energy slowly returning to my core. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me moving. Just as I was beginning to feel a semblance of readiness, I sensed something, multiple presences approaching from the direction of the camp, moving at a rapid speed. My eyes snapped open, my body going instantly alert. Hounds! The realization hit me like a cold wave. The pursuit team was here. Chapter 67. Pursuit. Hounds. A special team that is rumored to be specialized in hunting those who escaped from the army or their duties. It was said that they were all soldiers who were proficient in controlling the specially trained earthhounds, a special type of mana beast that has been tamed and is now used. Depending on its strength, a single earthhound can track a person from 10 kilometers away. As expected, they are already here. I didn't waste any time. I pushed myself to my feet. My body had recovered to a certain extent as well, and my mana reserves were almost fully recovered. I would have fully recovered unless not for the fact that I spent some mana mindlessly trying to learn a new thing, but that wouldn't change much. But I couldn't afford to stay here any longer. The hounds were specialists in tracking. Their senses were heightened, and they could easily pick up my trail if I stayed in one place for too long. I started running, my legs carrying me through the dense underbrush with practiced ease. The forest blurred around me as I pushed myself to my limits, but even with my speed, I could hear the distant barks and growls of the earthhounds closing in. They were fast, faster than I anticipated. I could sense at least 8 presences trailing me, their intent clear. If I were to face them head-on, I'd eventually be overwhelmed. I couldn't allow that to happen. My only options were to either kite them in the forest, using the terrain to my advantage, or to escape their range entirely. The second option seemed safer, but I knew it was exactly what the pursuit team expected me to try. They were experts in their craft, and they'd likely try to push me toward one of the more dangerous zones in the forest, the Shattered Vale. The Shattered Vale was infamous among those familiar with the Shadowed Thicket. It was a place where the forest's natural mana had gone wild, warping the landscape and filling it with deadly creatures. The very air there crackled with unstable energy, making it a treacherous place even for seasoned warriors. If the pursuit team could corner me there, I'd be forced to deal with not only them but also the deadly environment and the monsters that inhabited it. A nightmare scenario. I can't let them dictate the terms of this chase, I thought, my mind racing as I continued to move through the forest. I need to create my own opening. I decided to kite them, using the dense forest to my advantage. The earthhounds were fast and relentless, but they were also large and not as agile in tight spaces. If I could lead them through narrow, densely packed areas of the forest, I could slow them down and perhaps even lose a few of them. But at the same time it will be dangerous for me as well. Even though Elias had a rough map of the forest, it was not that accurate as it was only created by circling around the Shattered Vale. And the mapper was not a professional. Thus, the terrain is not that shown in a detailed way. If there was one thing that held me back, it was the fact that I was also not familiar with the forest too much. I also needed to explore the forest itself. at least until I reach the river that is shown on the map. From that point on, the life will become easier. However, that was easier said than done. In any case, I need to thin their numbers. Right now, they are probably not expecting me to turn and attack them. I should capitalize on this. I continued to run, my mind calculating the best way to deal with the hounds and their handlers. I needed to make them spread out to create opportunities where I could pick them off one by one. The terrain and the darkness were my allies, and I had to use them to my advantage. As I moved through the forest, I suddenly sensed another bunch of presence nearby. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but my sharp instincts, honed over years of battlefield experience, picked up on it. Bloodlust, but it was thin, nicely concealed. Whoever or whatever these predators were, they were skilled at hiding their intent. I had already realized that I wasn't the only hunter in this part of the forest, but that would also mean I wasn't the only one hunted either. A plan began to form in my mind. If I could lure the pursuit team into these predators' territory, I could use them to my advantage. They wouldn't be expecting it, and the surprise could buy me the time I needed. I continued to run, gradually altering my course to lead the hounds toward the source of that bloodlust. I moved with purpose, making sure to keep my own presence concealed as much as possible. The hounds were still on my trail, but their handlers were likely relying on their instincts, not expecting me to lead them into danger. After running for a while, I sensed that I was close to where the predators were lurking. I needed to act quickly and decisively. I spotted a large tree with thick branches and leaped up, climbing swiftly and silently until I was hidden among the foliage. The hounds and their handlers were closing in, unaware of the trap I was setting. I reached into my pouch and pulled out a small rock, channeling my mana into it. The rock absorbed the energy, glowing faintly in the darkness. This much should be enough. More than that, the rock will be broken. I waited, listening intently to the sounds of the forest, and then I threw the rock with precise aim toward a beast that was hiding in one of the trees. A darkened chimpanzee. The rock struck the beast, and the effect was immediate. The darkened chimpanzee let out a sharp, angry chatter, its eyes blazing with fury as it searched for the source of the disturbance. It was a highly territorial creature, and I knew it would react aggressively. The chimpanzee's chatter echoed through the forest, alerting its kin. Within moments, several more darkened chimpanzees emerged from the shadows, their forms barely visible in the dark. They were powerful and agile, their bloodlust now fully awakened. Swoosh! As the hounds and their handlers drew closer, the darkened chimpanzees began to descend from the trees, their movements swift and coordinated. The pursuit team had no idea what was waiting for them. As expected, they are unable to sense them. But the Earth Hounds will realize that soon enough. And just as I had predicted, a howl echoed in the forest. Growling, the Earth Hounds were getting more and more restless with each second it seemed. As I crouched in the thick branches of the tree, hidden from sight, I could hear the hounds and their handlers approaching. The sounds of the Earth Hounds growling and the rustling of leaves grew louder, signaling their proximity. The tension in the air was palpable, the forest seemingly holding its breath in anticipation of the coming conflict. "Stay alert," one of the soldiers whispered harshly to the others, his voice barely audible over the growls of the Earth Hounds. "The hounds are sensing something. Keep your weapons ready." The unit slowed their pace, becoming more cautious as they sensed the growing danger. I watched as the soldiers began to move into a defensive formation, their movements swift and practiced. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were trained for situations just like this, capable of handling unexpected threats with efficiency. "Something's off," another soldier muttered. "The hounds are too restless. Keep an eye on the trees." They were aware but not fully. The darkened chimpanzees were already closing in, their bloodlust filling the air, but the soldiers were too focused on the ground. They hadn't yet realized the full extent of the threat lurking above them. The Earth Hounds let out low growls, their instincts picking up on the danger from the trees. They began to circle the soldiers, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the threat. Growling, the tension built as the darkened chimpanzees prepared to strike, their eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. The soldiers, sensing the imminent attack, tightened their formation, their weapons at the ready. "Prepare for an attack from above," the lead soldier barked, his voice carrying authority. But before they could fully react, the darkened chimpanzees launched their assault. Swoosh! The first chimpanzee leaped from the tree, its claws extended, aiming for one of the hounds. The earth hound snarled and tried to evade, but the chimpanzee was too fast, sinking its claws into the beast's flank. "Attack formation 2, the lead soldier ordered. The soldiers moved with precision, their spears and swords flashing as they countered the onslaught of the darkened chimpanzees. The air was filled with the sounds of snarls, screeches, and the clash of weapons. The soldiers were well trained, their formation tight as they defended against the chimpanzees' frenzied attacks. But I wasn't going to stay idle. After all, this was what I had been waiting for. Chapter 68. Pursuit 2. Attack Formation 2. The soldier's voice rang out with authority, and the unit instantly shifted into a defensive formation of 8 sides, each soldier covering a direction. Their movements were fluid and practiced, showing their training and discipline. The formation was designed to counter threats from all directions, and it was clear they had dealt with similar situations before. The darkened chimpanzees, however, were no ordinary beasts. Each one was as strong as a 2-star awakened, and when they worked together, their collective intelligence made them even more dangerous. They moved with a predatory grace, their eyes glowing with a fierce hunger as they circled the soldiers, sizing them up. The soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons, their expressions grim but focused. They knew they were up against a formidable foe, but their training had prepared them for such challenges. They kept their formation tight, shields and spears ready to intercept any attack. One of the darkened chimpanzees made the first move, darting forward with incredible speed, its claws aiming for the soldier directly in front of it. The soldier reacted instantly, raising his shield to block the strike while another soldier on his left lunged with his spear, aiming to pierce the beast's side. Clang! The chimpanzee's claws met the shield with a powerful impact, but the soldier held firm. The spear found its mark, stabbing into the creature's flank, but it wasn't a fatal blow. Ga-ga-ga! The chimpanzee hissed in pain and anger, retreating just as another of its kin leaped at a different soldier from the opposite side. The darkened chimpanzees coordinated their attacks, each strike calculated to probe the soldier's defenses. They didn't attack recklessly. Instead, they used their speed and agility to wear down the formation, forcing the soldiers to constantly adjust and react. A third chimpanzee attempted to flank the formation, its eyes gleaming with cunning. It lunged low, aiming for the legs of a soldier trying to knock him off balance. But the soldier was ready, swiftly stepping back while another soldier behind him thrust his spear downward, driving the beast back. "Keep the formation tight," the lead soldier barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The soldiers held their ground, their movements precise and coordinated. They had the advantage of formation and discipline, but the darkened chimpanzees had numbers and ferocity. The battle was intense, with neither side gaining a clear upper hand. The chimpanzees snarled and screeched, their frustration growing as their attacks were repelled time and again. They were intelligent enough to realize that brute force alone wouldn't break the soldiers' defenses. Instead, they began to target specific points in the formation, trying to isolate a soldier and overwhelm him before the others could react. One chimpanzee feigned an attack on the left side, drawing the attention of the soldiers there, while another 2 simultaneously launched a coordinated strike from the right. The soldiers reacted quickly, but the maneuver forced them to split their focus, creating a momentary gap in their defense. A chimpanzee lunged into that gap, its claws slashing at a soldier's side. The soldier grunted in pain, his armor taking most of the impact but leaving him staggered. The creature pressed its advantage, claws flashing as it aimed for the exposed flesh. "Hold the line!" the lead soldier shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The soldiers quickly closed ranks, their spears darting forward to drive the chimpanzee back. But the beast was relentless, its attacks growing more vicious as it sensed weakness. The soldiers fought back with everything they had, their spears and swords moving in a deadly dance to keep the beasts at bay. Despite their best efforts, the darkened chimpanzees were proving to be a formidable challenge. The soldiers were well trained, but the chimpanzees' intelligence and teamwork were pushing them to their limits. The formation was holding, but barely, with the soldiers forced into a defensive posture as they struggled to fend off the relentless assault. The beasts worked in unison, communicating with sharp, guttural sounds as they adjusted their tactics. Their eyes gleamed with a predatory cunning that spoke of their intelligence, and it was clear they were far from ordinary mana beasts. The battle was a test of endurance, with both sides locked in a deadly struggle for dominance. The darkened chimpanzees were determined to break the soldiers' formation, while the soldiers were equally determined to hold their ground. But I wasn't going to let this opportunity pass. As the soldiers and the chimpanzees clashed, I prepared to strike from the shadows. While this was not something that I had specialized in or trained with, the chaos of the battle provided the perfect cover for me to slip in unnoticed, my estoc ready to deliver a lethal blow to any soldier who showed a momentary lapse in focus. I moved silently, circling around the formation, waiting for the right moment to strike. The soldiers were too focused on the beasts to notice me, and I knew that even a brief distraction could be enough to tip the balance in favor of the chimpanzees. One soldier, slightly separated from the others as he fended off a particularly aggressive chimpanzee, caught my attention. His movements were slower, the strain of the battle clearly taking its toll. I could see the opening, the vulnerability in his defense. Swoosh! Without hesitation, I darted forward, my estoc piercing through the air. Stab! The blade found its mark, sinking deep into the soldier's side before he could react. Arg! He gasped, his body convulsing as the blade penetrated his flesh. The soldier's gasp of pain drew the attention of his comrades almost immediately. The moment they saw me, their eyes widened in shock and recognition. He's here! The target is here! One of them shouted, his voice filled with a mix of alarm and determination. The soldiers quickly adjusted their formation, trying to account for both the darkened chimpanzees and my sudden appearance. But they were already strained, and my presence only added to their growing desperation. The chimpanzees, too, noticed the shift in the battle. Their eyes flickered between the soldiers and me, their predatory instincts kicking in. They were intelligent, and I knew it wouldn't be long before they realized I was as much a threat to them as I was to the soldiers. I couldn't afford to let that happen. I had to keep the balance in the fight, using the chaos to my advantage. If the chimpanzees identified me as the primary threat, they would likely turn their full attention on me, and I'd be overwhelmed. Swoosh! Another soldier lunged at me, his sword gleaming in the dim light of the forest. I parried his strike with my estoc, deflecting the blade with a sharp twist of my wrist. The soldier staggered, off balance, and I took the opportunity to drive my estoc into his chest. Arg! He cried out as the blade pierced his heart, and he collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The remaining soldiers hesitated, their formation faltering as they tried to process the new threat I posed. The chimpanzees seized the moment, launching a coordinated attack on the weakened soldiers. The beasts moved with lethal efficiency, their claws and fangs tearing into flesh as they pressed the advantage. But that was not the case for every one of them. 3 chimpanzees were now locked onto me, looking at my eyes. They are quick, not bad. It seemed that for such monsters to survive in this forest, much intelligence was needed. But for a mere beast, you have quite the bloodlust. Void Starfall Blade. Storm of Blank Starred. The command resonated through the air, and the estoc responded. The starlight intensified, casting a pale glow across the darkened forest. The 3 chimpanzees hesitated, their instincts warning them of the danger they now faced. But it was already too late. Swoosh! I moved with the speed of a falling star, my estoc slicing through the air in a blur of motion. The first chimpanzee barely had time to react as the blade cut through its chest, the starlight searing its flesh with a blinding flash. It let out a pained screech, its body convulsing as the light tore through it from the inside out. Screech! The second chimpanzee lunged at me, its claws extended in a desperate attempt to strike me down. but I was already anticipating its move. I sidestepped, the starlight trailing behind me as I brought the estoc around in a wide arc. The blade met the creature's neck, slicing clean through with a single, fluid motion. The chimpanzee's headless body collapsed to the ground, the starlight still shimmering in the darkness. The third chimpanzee, sensing the fate of its comrades, let out a guttural snarl and tried to retreat into the shadows. But I wasn't about to let it escape. With a burst of speed, I closed the distance between us, my estoc humming with power as I thrust it forward. The blade pierced through the chimpanzee's heart, and the starlight erupted from the tip of the estoc in a radiant explosion. The light engulfed the creature, its form disintegrating into nothingness as the stars claimed it. The forest fell silent once more, the echoes of the battle fading into the night. The starlight slowly dimmed, the estoc returning to its normal, unassuming appearance. The three chimpanzees lay defeated, their bloodlust extinguished. I stood amidst the carnage, my breath steady as I surveyed the battlefield. The soldiers were still locked in combat with the remaining chimpanzees, but their numbers had dwindled significantly. The balance of the fight had shifted in my favor. I could see the fear in the soldiers' eyes, their confidence shattered by the sight of their fallen comrades and the power I had unleashed. The chimpanzees, too, were beginning to falter, their earlier aggression giving way to hesitation. I had done what I needed to. The battlefield was mine. You are all my prey from now on. Chapter 69. Pursuit. 3. Please. No. The young man stood over the bodies, his cold black eyes staring down at the pleading soldier. The moonlight filtered through the dense canopy above, casting eerie shadows across the blood-soaked ground. The forest was silent, the earlier chaos of battle now reduced to the hushed whispers of the wind. Lucavion's expression remained impassive, unreadable, as he gazed at the soldier lying before him. The man was wounded, his armor dented and bloodied, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Fear and desperation were etched on his face, his hands trembling as he reached out in a futile plea for mercy. Lucavion's grip tightened around the hilt of his estoc. The blade, still glowing faintly with residual starlight, seemed to absorb the light around it, making the darkness even more profound. His gaze was unwavering, cold, and devoid of empathy as he looked down at the soldier who was begging for forgiveness and mercy. "This is the job you have chosen to do," Lucavion said, his voice flat and emotionless. "There is no need to ask forgiveness." The soldier's eyes widened in despair, tears mingling with the blood on his face, as he realized the inevitability of his fate. Lucavion's words were final, devoid of any offer of hope or reprieve. "At least protect your honor as a soldier," Lucavion continued, his tone unyielding. "If you must die, do so with dignity." The soldier's trembling intensified, but his pleas had died in his throat. He knew there would be no mercy here, no last-minute salvation. This demon before him had made his decision. "Yo, you are a demon," the soldier mumbled as he gritted his teeth. All of his comrades, all of them were fallen in this place. Their bodies were scattered around the forest. Without another word, Lucavion raised his estoc and, with a swift, precise motion, drove the blade into the soldier's heart. The man gasped, his body convulsing as the life drained from him. His eyes, wide with fear and pain, slowly glazed over as death claimed him. Lucavion watched as the soldier's body went limp, his expression unchanged. He withdrew the blade, the motion smooth and practiced, and wiped the blood from it with a cold efficiency. The stock's glow dimmed, returning to its usual appearance as if the act had been nothing more than routine. But this was not the end. Lucavion turned his gaze toward the three remaining chimpanzees. They stood a short distance away, their eyes locked onto him with a mixture of fear and caution. The earlier aggression they had displayed was now gone, replaced by a primal fear that emanated from their very cores. Indeed, the reason for their fear was scattered around the forest. The carcasses of their own kin lay in the shadows, each one of them cut down by the estoc now held in Lucavion's hand. The once ferocious beasts were now little more than lifeless husks, their bodies torn apart by the very force they had underestimated. "Are you scared?" Lucavion asked, looking at them. The three chimpanzees took a step back, their eyes darting between Lucavion and the remains of their fallen brethren. They could sense the power and the lethal precision that had been their undoing. The confidence that had once fueled their bloodlust was shattered, leaving only the instinct to survive. Lucavion met their gaze, his expression still cold, still merciless. He could see the fear in their eyes, the hesitation that gripped them as they weighed their options. But he knew they were cornered, their numbers too few, their morale too broken. Lucavion pointed his estoc at the three remaining chimpanzees, the blade gleaming faintly under the moonlight. The air around them seemed to thicken with tension as the beasts locked eyes with the young man who had just slaughtered their kin with terrifying precision. The chimpanzees, now fully aware of the threat before them, took another cautious step back. Their earlier ferocity was gone, replaced by a deep-seated fear that gnawed at their instincts. They could sense it, this human was no ordinary opponent. He was a demon, a creature of death who would not allow them to escape. They knew, in their primal hearts, that fleeing would be futile. The demon before them would hunt them down, one by one, until they were all lying dead at his feet. There was no mercy in his eyes, no hesitation in his movements. The only thing they could see in those cold black eyes was the certainty of their own demise. Lucavion's expression remained unchanged, his gaze unwavering as he assessed the three creatures. He could see the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else, an understanding, a resignation. That is why they are more dangerous, he thought. These beasts knew they would not leave this place alive, but that very knowledge made them all the more dangerous. A cornered beast, when it had nothing left to lose, was at its most lethal. The instinct to survive was deeply ingrained in every sentient being, driving them to acts of desperation when faced with certain death. The chimpanzees snarled, their fear now mingled with a desperate resolve. They exchanged quick, guttural sounds as they communicated with one another, their bodies tense and ready for the inevitable clash. They knew they would not survive, but they would not go down without a fight. Lucavion watched them carefully, his estoc still pointed in their direction. He could see the subtle shift in their stance, the way their muscles coiled in preparation for a final, desperate assault. The beasts had made their decision. They would fight not for victory, but for the slim chance of survival. But Lucavion was ready. "Come," he said softly, almost as if inviting them to their doom. "Let's finish this." With a guttural roar, the first chimpanzee lunged at him, its claws outstretched in a furious attempt to tear him apart. The other two followed suit, their fear momentarily overridden by the primal need to fight for their lives. Lucavion moved with the fluidity, his estoc slicing through the air. Swoosh! Stab! The first chimpanzee barely had time to react as the blade pierced through its chest, the starlight once again flaring with lethal intensity. Screech! The beast let out a final, pained cry before collapsing to the ground, its body convulsing as the life drained from it. Lucavion didn't pause, his focus already shifting to the remaining two chimpanzees. Swoosh! The second chimpanzee tried to flank him, its eyes wild with desperation. It swiped at him with its claws, but Lucavion sidestepped the attack with ease, his estoc flashing in a quick, precise arc. The blade cut through the beast's side, the starlight searing its flesh. The chimpanzee staggered, blood pouring from the wound, but it did not back down. Grew! It lunged at Lucavion again, its movements more frantic, more reckless. Stab! But Lucavion was unrelenting, his blade finding its mark once more, this time piercing the creature's heart. Thud! The second chimpanzee collapsed, its body falling limply to the ground beside its fallen comrade. Only one remained. Now, will you escape? Or will you try to avenge your fallen comrades? Lucavion asked. Some might think asking them was just pointless, but Lucavion had witnessed how smart those chimpanzees could be. That is why he talked to them. Maybe they could understand him to some extent. Who knew? The last chimpanzee stood still for a moment, its body tense, eyes flickering between the bodies of its fallen kin and Lucavion. "What are you going to do?" The fear was evident in its gaze, but there was something more. A lingering sadness, a hesitation that Lucavion could sense even without being proficient in reading emotions. Its chest heaved with heavy breaths, and its muscles twitched as if caught between the primal instinct to flee and a deeper, more complex emotion. Lucavion, despite his cold face, recognized the weight of what the beast was feeling. It had lost its comrades and its pack and now faced an insurmountable foe. There was no way out, no escape from the fate that awaited it. "In the end, you beasts are not that different from us humans, is it not?" he thought. In his days on the battlefield, he had seen countless vile acts. How humans killed each other, how people just disappeared from the world. He was also in the same spot as this chimpanzee once. Lucavion met the creature's gaze, his own eyes unwavering, yet with a rare moment of empathy. "Come," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "Come and die a warrior's death." The words seemed to hang in the air, and for a brief moment, it was as if the forest itself had stilled, waiting for the chimpanzee's response. The beast's eyes locked onto Lucavion's, and something passed between them. A silent understanding, a recognition of the inevitability of the moment. With a final, deep breath, the chimpanzee made its choice. It let out a fierce, guttural growl, its fear giving way to a desperate resolve. This was not about victory or survival anymore. It was about facing the end with dignity, with the courage that its fallen kin had shown. The beast charged at Lucavion, its claws outstretched, teeth bared in a last, defiant attack. The ground trembled under the force of its sprint, and the air crackled with the intensity of the moment. Lucavion stood his ground, his estoc steady in his hand, ready to meet the beast's final charge. He watched the chimpanzee close the distance, its eyes burning with a mixture of rage and sorrow. There was no hesitation in its movements now, no sign of retreat, only the determination to face its fate head-on. Swoosh! The chimpanzee lunged at Lucavion with all its might, its claws slashing through the air, aiming for his throat. But Lucavion was faster, his body moving with the precision of a seasoned warrior. He sidestepped the attack, the motion fluid and effortless, and brought his estoc around in a swift, lethal arc. The blade found its mark, slicing cleanly through the beast's chest, piercing its heart with unerring accuracy. Thud! The chimpanzee let out a final, mournful cry as it fell to the ground, its body collapsing at Lucavion's feet. Its eyes, once filled with fear and pain, slowly dimmed as the life drained from them. The forest was silent once more, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Lucavion stood over the fallen beast, his expression unreadable. No, that was not the case. His expression. There was a smile on his face. "Master, this addiction to killing, I may never be able to forget it." Chapter 70, Death Mana. What would happen to a young child who was abandoned on the battlefield? A young child who was forced to swallow the harshness of life and was forced to end someone's life at the age of 14. It would definitely depend on the person in the question, but there is one thing that would be clear. It is a fact that the child would not be like a normal person. "Master, this addiction to killing, I may never be able to forget it." Lucavion stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving with each breath. The thrill of battle still buzzed in his veins, and the smile on his face betrayed the dark satisfaction he felt. The battlefield around him was littered with the bodies of the fallen. 8 pairs of humans and earthhounds and 13 chimpanzees, their lifeless forms scattered across the blood-stained ground. The air was thick with the scent of blood and death. His body ached from the exertion, muscles protesting with every movement. Lucavion could feel the sting of several wounds, the deeper ones reminding him of how close he had come to death multiple times during the fight. The chimpanzees, feral and relentless, had fought with a wild fury, but they were no match for his skill and precision. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a low-rank potion, uncorking it with a quick twist of his hand. The liquid inside glowed faintly, a pale blue light that promised relief. Gulp! Without hesitation, he downed the potion in one gulp, grimacing at the bitter taste as it slid down his throat. Almost immediately, he felt the effects. His wounds began to close, the pain receding as the potion worked its magic. Lucavion wiped the sweat from his brow, his gaze drifting over the battlefield. The carcasses of the fallen beasts and men lay strewn about, a reminder of the carnage that had just taken place. He walked among the fallen, his expression unreadable once more. The thrill of the killing still lingered, but now it was tempered by a growing exhaustion. This place, no one should come to this place for a while. Now that he had dealt with the pursuit team, he was in a state where he could finally relax a little bit. At least he needed to, since while he was smiling at the end of the fight, that did not mean that he was in a good condition. No, that was completely in reverse. He had also exerted himself. At some point, the chimpanzees also realized that he was the real target here. Thus, they also attacked him. The soldier's target was already him from the start. Thus, the battlefield turned into all versus him. And that was taxing for him in the end. No matter the difference between the strengths, a bunch of people attacking one at the same time was bound to be taxing. Now, I should mediate a little. As he reached the center of the battlefield, Lucavion sank to the ground, crossing his legs and settling into a lotus position. The silence of the forest enveloped him, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Closing his eyes, he began to meditate, drawing his focus inward. He needed to recover to regain the strength he had expended in the fight. As he breathed deeply, centering himself, he felt it again. That same cold, eerie mana rising around him. Lucavion opened his eyes slightly, peering through his lashes at the nearest carcass. A chimpanzee, its body still and lifeless. The cold mana seemed to seep from the dead creature, tendrils of it snaking toward him, drawn to his presence like moths to a flame. So, it wasn't just the shadow stalker, he thought, his mind piecing together the puzzle. The cold mana wasn't unique to that one beast. It was a byproduct of death itself, a residual energy that clung to the bodies of the fallen. The mana of the death. I see, he thought. Before, he had attributed the mana that he felt to Shadow Stalker, but now he realized. That was not the case. But how? And he had never heard of someone normal using the mana of death. Even necromancers did not use such mana. While they meddled with death and souls, it was not in this form. The mana they used was dark mana, something that was still in the category of fundamental mana structures. While the dark mages were mostly associated with evil and dangerous organizations, he had never heard of them utilizing the mana from the ones who died. It must be something unique to me. Then he realized. Is it because of my condition? Because my mana meridians were reversed? Just as he asked himself this question, he suddenly realized. That could really have been the case, as he was unable to sense the normal orthodox mana on his own. He needed a medium for that. But, then, why did he have meridians? For which reason did he have such things? If he would not be able to use mana, then why? It was because of this. Rather than allowing him to sense and use orthodox mana, his body had adapted, or been forced to adapt, to something far more sinister and unique, the mana of death. His reversed meridians, far from being a hindrance, were, in fact, perfectly attuned to this energy. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. I see. Lucavion had never been able to see this before because he had never meditated in the presence of death. Not like this. The energy had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, but only now did he have the opportunity to tap into it. But then another question arose, one that gnawed at the edge of his consciousness. If this was truly the mana of death, how was the serpent flame art able to coexist with it? He closed his eyes again, focusing on his core. The energies within him were not exactly coexisting in harmony as he had first thought. The fire-attributed mana of the serpent flame art was not blending with the death mana. It was keeping it in check like a cage of fire, holding back the cold darkness. The fire served as a counterbalance, preventing the death mana from overwhelming his system. But that means, if the black mana truly was the mana of death, then its corresponding opposite must be the mana of life. His body, with its reversed meridians, was naturally attuned to death, but for balance, he would need to introduce the opposite mana that was warm, vibrant, and life-affirming. I need to adjust the mana flow and the circulation. The idea began to take shape in his mind. If his body was naturally aligned with death mana, then to control it effectively, he would need to create a flow of life mana in the reverse direction of his own meridians. The two opposing forces could stabilize each other, much like how fire and death were interacting now. Since he already knew how to draw in fire mana, he could use that as a starting point. Fire was associated with life and destruction, but it still carried the warmth and vitality that life mana embodied. He would have to reverse his thinking, channeling the fire mana in such a way that it flowed counter to the death mana's natural path, balancing the energies within his core. Lucavion began to mentally map out the new circulation path, imagining how the two energies would flow within him. It was a delicate balance. One wrong move and the energies could clash violently, but if he could get it right, he would gain unprecedented control over both forms of mana. Slowly, cautiously, he began to apply the theory. He focused on drawing in the fire mana, channeling it through his meridians in the opposite direction of the death mana's flow. The sensation was strange, almost disorienting, as if he were rewiring his own body's natural instincts. At first, the process was difficult. The fire mana was reluctant to move against the flow it was used to, but Lucavion persisted, guiding it carefully, adjusting the flow bit by bit. He could feel the death mana reacting, pushing back slightly, but not with the same violent resistance as before. The two energies began to settle into a tenuous balance, each keeping the other in check. Sweat dripped down Lucavion's brow as he concentrated, his entire focus on maintaining the equilibrium within him. It was exhausting, but he could feel it working. The fire mana, though still not perfect, was starting to stabilize the death mana, preventing it from spiraling out of control. I'm getting closer, he thought, his determination renewed. But he knew he wasn't out of the woods yet. This was only the first step. He still needed to refine the process to perfect the balance between life and death within him. But at least now he had a direction, a way forward.
Hello everyone. We now have a Discord server. Join us for faster updates, discussions about your favorite novels, and exclusive Discord-only content. Don't miss out. See you there. Scan the QR code on the screen or enter any of the displayed links into your browser to join our Discord.